I'm really excited to be here with all of you this afternoon to talk about my book and its relation to the Yale collection of Western Americana. So, American Burial Ground is essentially a reinterpretation of a familiar event, and that event being the westward migration of predominantly white um, Euro-American settlers um, across overland routes to the Pacific coast in the mid-19th century. And as I argue in the book, the shared trials and tragedies of these trails really help to link them, and in many ways, the entirety of the West together as a landscape of white American suffering and sacrifice. Now, one of the key features of this migration is that it is long. This is really a long migration in every sense. It's long geographically, over 2,000 miles, which is a big deal to travel overland at a time when it's much easier to travel by water. It's also long chronologically. So people migrate for decades. They start as early as the mid 1830s when the first wagons make it to Oregon, and then they continue into the 1860s and even past 1869 when the Transcontinental Railroad is finished, although it's less common to use wagons after that date. And it's also long in terms of its legacy. So for a number of reasons, this migration to the Pacific coast across these multiple wagon routes pictured here remains a migration that continues to be traced in K-16 classrooms, in voluminous interpretations produced by trail enthusiasts and the National Park Service, and in guided tours, as well as exhibit materials at a variety of historic sites. So this migration continues to play an important role in public history and national memory. And I decided that because of that, it demanded additional academic scholarship. And then a final thing about the length of this migration is that my process for writing this book was also long. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this process in my presentation. But basically, one of the things I learned is that there are no good shortcuts on the trail, and there are no good shortcuts in historical research and writing. But I was motivated, and I was motivated to keep going because I really wanted to bring a fresh perspective to the enduring legacy of the trail. So here are some examples of the long reach of this migration's legacy in US popular culture. And one of the ways we can think about this is representations of wagon trains on cinema, in television, and also in computer games. So our first image comes from 1930. This is the wagon train as depicted in the epic film The Big Trail. You might recognize John Wayne there on the left. And then from 1967, we have the cinematic adaptation of a Guthrie's novel, The Way West. Here we have more of a focus on the domesticity of the trail. So this iconic image is not only of the wagons, but the women and children walking alongside them, the gender division of labor with the men on horseback and driving the wagons. And then just to make the point that wagon train westerns have not gone away in the 21st century, here's a still from Taylor Sheridan's series, 1883. And I could talk about 1883 for a long time, but I just want to make the point that wagon train westerns are still being created in the 2020s. And then for wagon trains on video and computer games, we have the revamped Oregon Trail game, which came out in 2021. And then we have the classic green and black pixelated game from the 1990s, which is more of the version that I played. I don't know why the wagon looks like a paper towel roll, but it does. But this is really what I was interested in when I started this project, is thinking about the westward moving wagons in American popular culture, and how does the history of this migration in the 19th century help to explain this endurance. And the reason why I got interested in this topic wasn't so much the game itself, although I'd played that, but it was an internship I had at Fort Casper in Casper, Wyoming, which is a Civil War era fort along the Platte River in Wyoming, but it was also an immigrant sort of way station and river crossing point. The members of the LDS Church, colloquially known as Mormons, operated a paid ferry there for many years in the middle decades of the 19th century. So that's me in the shadows with the hat and the blue polo. And I spent a summer out at Fort Caspar. I was basically outside all day, and I would answer visitor questions. Showed them some artifacts we had, reproductions we had on a table outside, and I led tours. And it was really interesting to hear from the folks who came through because I got a real understanding of the passion and the knowledge that many of them held for the trail and for this migration. And I found that really interesting because at the time I was doing this internship, I was also reading a lot of Western history. I was planning to go to graduate school, and I was beginning to realize that historians hadn't written about this migration in decades. Now, what was most interesting to those Fort Caspar Museum visitors was my name, Sarah Kais, which is the same name as the first member of the Donner Party of Donner Party cannibalism infamy to die. Um, and, we might all wish for some claim to fame, and this, I discovered, at least in Trails World, was mine. I don't think I have an actual familial connection to the Donner Party, but it's my understanding that my Beinecke colleague Matt Mason does, so you never know. But even from the beginning, right, Sarah Kai is the Donner Party of my sort of exposure to trail history and memory, evidence is pointing to the prominence of death and dying on the trail experience. And of course, that's the central narrative of the Oregon Trail game as well. You pack up your wagon, you try to make it across to Oregon, you die of dysentery, you die of starvation, you have a wagon accident, and you don't make it. It's game over for you, and you have to start over to Oregon. I knew this narrative well. I'd lost the game tons and tons of times, but I was starting to see it cropping up as a pattern and other legacies of the trail as well. What I ultimately found in doing my book, however, is that it wasn't game over for those who died. As I delved deep into trail documents and looked far and wide among other sources of the 19th century, I found something else, that the deaths along the way changed the experience and the meaning of the trail for travelers and Americans at large, and ultimately helped to advance westward expansion. This doesn't mean that these deaths weren't a loss, that they didn't mark failures. I mean, if you're migrating somewhere and you don't make it to Oregon or to California, or as we're tragically seeing now around the world, the deaths at the US-Mexico border, or for migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea, that's a loss. But these deaths on the trail will also ultimately become something else. And they become something else because of the specific context of 19th century white Protestant culture and because of the political urge for expansion. And I share this image here to give you a sense of the work of death on the Overland Trail. This is a drawing by cartographer and draftsman Joseph J. Goldsboro Bruff, who some of you may be familiar with. Bruff becomes one of the most well-known recorders of graves along the trail. And this sketch, Immigrant's Burial, shows Bruff's Mail Mining Company burying and marking the grave of Charles Bishop. The headstone reads, Charles Bishop of Washington City, what we would call Washington, D.C., died July 8th, 1849 of cholera, aged 25 years. Now, one of the conceits of commentators and immigrants in the 19th century was that men would not be good nurses and that they would not be good caretakers. But we actually see time and again men taking on these roles when they need to on the migration. And we see it here as well in them taking care of Bishop's body. They don't simply bury him by their campsite. They organize a funeral procession. They carry his remains to a spot on a rise. They dig a hole. A spot on a rise means that later travelers are going to be able to more easily identify the location of his grave, more easily go to pay their own respects. And they mark the grave the best they can. They pile extra rocks on top in order to try to protect the physical remains underneath. And they erect a marker with details of his name, his death, his age, in order that his individual memory can be preserved. So there's a lot of care, time, effort, and labor that goes into marking these graves. And these drawings and these graves that are dotted across the continent become really important to understanding the experience of this migration. In fact, they start to place suffering and sacrifice at the center of the trail legacy rather than to the side. And this is really important for how this suffering shapes the cultural narrative, the meaning of this migration. And it's different than how a lot of people have thought about the trail, because there's been an overwhelming amount of cultural and historical interpretations, really dating all the way back to the 19th century, that have depicted the overland migration as something else, as a caravan of covered wagons transporting men, women, and children across the sunny plains. And these narratives, the trail is triumphal, it's heroic, and it's peaceful. It's about supposedly hardy immigrants surmounting obstacles like the mountain depicted here to reach the fertile lands of Oregon and the golden lands of California. And I love this painting, Westward, the Course of Empire, because there's so much going on in it, not only in the central scene, but also the images on the side. This is likely a depiction of South Pass in Wyoming. It's showing that sunny, triumphal image of immigrants triumphing westward over the Rocky Mountains. It's painted by one of the most famous historical narrative painters of the 19th century, Emanuel Leutze. He also famously painted Washington crossing the Delaware in the early 1850s. And then about 10 years later, he's commissioned by the Union government during the Civil War to paint a representation of westward expansion to hang in the Capitol building that they're renovating during this conflict. But this image also got very, very close to centering the suffering and sacrifice that I'm arguing that people in the 19th century and to this day recognized as at the center of the meaning of this migration. So I brought up this very loopy red circle I drew to show you something that's missing in this final painting that was still present in the mural study, which was sort of the last draft that Leutze created before he completed this painting in 1862. So here was our image of the mural study. This is zoom level 1 for what I want to show you that's missing in the ultimate final version. And here's zoom level 2. So this is what we're looking at here is not triumph, but suffering and sacrifice, the pain of burial and the work of death, much like Brough recorded in his sketch from 1849. And so my point here is that while the Union government had a vested interest in depicting westward migration as a triumph during the Civil War, that 19th century people, including Leutze, like immigrants, recognized its tragedies, and specifically the tragedy of dying along the way. And it's because of this that we have records from folks like Brough recording graves, recording acts of burial, because the trail was a treacherous, often deadly trek that leaves a string of burials like the one in the mural study and like Bishop's. And it's not only that immigrants bury their dead on the trail and that they try to remember them, it's what they think putting these bodies into the land does. And what they think putting these bodies into the land does is they think they leave little seeds, little markers of white claims to possession to native homelands. And there's a quote from another time and context that I think really speaks to this logic that parallels the same logic immigrants had in the mid-19th century. And that quote comes from a Serbian nationalist in the mid-20th century. And he's asked by someone like, well, where actually are Serbia's borders? Where does your nation exist? And he says, Serbia is wherever there's a Serbian grave. And in focusing on death, on putting forth this darker portrait of westward expansion, I think we're getting closer to understanding the trail than perhaps ever before. And I think we're getting closer to understanding it because this focus on death not only better captures the immigrant experience, but because it helps to connect the immigrant experience of expansion to the native experience of dispossession. A dispossession that probably many of you know is driven by broken treaties and wars, that undergird U.S. expansion to the Pacific. And this is one visual representation of dispossession in the 19th century. And this map comes from a digital project led by the historian Claudio Sant. And this is a depiction of the status of native land possession in January 1850. So we're about 6 months after Charles Bishop was buried. And Charles Bishop was buried between Scottsbluff in Nebraska and Fort Laramie in Wyoming. So he would have been buried in the blue, somewhere around here along the trail. And then this is the state of dispossession in January 1893, some 40 years later. And the burial of Bishop's corpse in native land, and the burials of thousands of other emigrants in the lands of the Lakota, Shoshone, Northern Paiute, and Southern Paiute, and other native polities through whose lands the trail cut, is an understudied part of this thread. The act of inserting immigrant corpses, such as Bishop's, into sovereign indigenous soil shaped U.S. claims to the land and efforts to remake native homelands into U.S. territory. But this history stretched beyond the role of dead immigrants in dispossession to include the importance of the indigenous defense of their homelands to shaping trail history. And this connection is one of those that it took me sort of a long time to come to during my process. When you think about overland immigrant collections, Native voices and perspectives aren't at the forefront. But that doesn't mean Native peoples weren't important to trail history. They absolutely were. And one of the ways they were important is in how they talked about their dead and their graves to resist dispossession and to describe their suffering and sacrifice during forced removals west. This drawing here by Cherokee artist Sam Watts Scott depicts one of the best known of these forced removal routes, the Cherokee Trail of Tears. But this Trail of Tears was also a trail of graves. The second image on this slide is of a letter that Cherokee woman Eliza Jane Ross wrote to her uncle John Ross in 1842, a few years after the Trail of Tears. Now, in the letter, Eliza tells John, who served as Cherokee principal chief, essentially the president, about the dead along the trail. And she's writing here to blame members of the treaty party for agreeing to removal, saying that as a result, they have, quote, seen the graves of their own people strewn many hundreds of miles along the roads and banks of the rivers in strange lands and amongst strangers without one friend to watch over their bones. This is the suffering of the Trail of Graves. And Eliza's words were just one of many examples of Native peoples describing their forced removal routes as marked by graves as well as tears. And they did so to document their suffering and the trauma of dispossession and to try to better Native relations with the United States. Another key feature of the fight against dispossession that I trace in chapter 1 of the book is the ways in which Indigenous people safeguarded and marked their ancestors' graves before they were forced from their homelands, as signs and symbols of their inextricability from the lands the U.S. was taking. But while this material and these arguments figure in the first chapter of my book, it's the last chapter I wrote and the one that took me the longest to figure out, because this project started from a dramatically different place than the one I arrived at. So I've talked a bit about my initial interest in the trail, how I saw it as a viable research topic, my conclusions about the centrality of death, suffering, and sacrifice. But now I want to tell you more about the process. So I'm going to take you a little bit more chronologically through my process rather than through my argument, talking first about my sources, the overland collections nationally and at the Beinecke, how these materials led me to place death at the center, and then how I came to articulate the ways Native peoples shaped the history of the trail. So I'll close with that final and key component of my book, as well as a few reflections on trail memory and memorialization. So the first thing I want to say about the sources is that there is a depth and richness to overland immigrant materials that is in many ways unparalleled. You can find them in archives across the United States. Some of them remain in personal collections or are still coming on the market today. And taken collectively, these accounts really are, as noted trail historian Dale L. Morgan evocatively called them, a mosaic in words of the personal experiences of the hundreds of thousands of immigrants who pinned their hopes and set their sights on reaching the Pacific. Now, Morgan was originally from Utah. He spent many years working at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. And I like his phrasing because it gives credit to the immigrants, some of whom struggled to put pen to paper, for sharing their individual and familial experiences with the world. Morgan is also one of the many figures who plays a role in the formation of the Yale collection of Western Americana in the mid-20th century. He works with collection materials. He's part of the same network as Archie Hanna, who stewarded the collection for many years. And not surprisingly, overland immigrant materials are a strength of our Western Americana collection. There are somewhere along the lines of 200 diaries and memoirs, not counting all of the published materials related to overland journeys like maps and pocket guidebooks. And some of these materials came to the library through William Robertson Coe's founding donation for Western Americana in 1942. This image of Coe on the left actually comes from the image in the Oregon-California Trail Association's Hall of Fame. They're known as OCTA, and they're a group of folks who sort of dedicate a lot of their time to preserving trail history in a variety of ways. And in 2022, OCTA selected Coe, actually along with Dale Morgan, to join their Hall of Fame. Other overland collections or overland items in our collection were added by Hannah. We have like Gardner K. Reed's account of his journey to California in 1850. You can see Morgan with, I believe, Hannah standing here in this photo. I do apologize for the glare. And many of the materials in our collection are relevant for my book because they shed light on the experience and meaning of death on the trail. So the Benjamin F. Adams papers deals directly with death and burial along the trail to California in 1849. So too does Robert Bond's overland journey to Great Salt Lake City. Bond doesn't make it to Salt Lake City. The account ends at Fort Bridger because of death, right? So there are many diaries that are cut short because of these deaths along the way. Another great item that I use in the book is Philip F. Castleman's diary. And this has fantastic descriptions of immigrant struggles with sickness. I think I pointed out very briefly that Charles Bishop had died of cholera. So disease is the greatest killer of immigrants on the trail, and particularly cholera is the greatest killer. There's a series of cholera epidemics that follow the great rush to California along the trails, because cholera is a bacteria that thrives in crowded conditions and can pass and kill people very, very quickly. So Castleman has an account of nursing for those who have fallen sick with cholera. He also sheds light on the experience of enslaved peoples and enslavers on the trail, which is also an important facet of this migration, and another thing like cholera that connects it to broader concerns of the 19th century. One of my favorite episodes in my book comes from the Henry Harding Patrick letters. These are with the call number WAMSSS-2463. And the letters describe Henry's mother, Susan's, demand that he narrates his journey. And she kind of tries to guilt him into it by describing how fantastic the narration of the journey her neighbor's son sent home, and she wants to get the same thing from him. And so one of the things you can see in the mid-19th century is that people are collecting these accounts not only after the fact, but as it's happening. Everyone wants to get their hands on the next great trail history. And for some of these collectors and curators, looking forward into the mid-20th century, collecting these overland migrations is really about telling a particular version of American history, this sort of triumphal Westward migration story. For some of these people, including Coe, it's like the perfect antidote to communism, the sort of individualist hardiness of this migration. But they can play in a lot of different ways. They certainly play differently in my reading of them. But I think that it is absolutely true that there is a particular passion and almost sort of frenzy for collecting these materials. And in a talk that he gave in 1992 that was published in the Yale Library Gazette. The bookseller William Reese, he gave a talk at the Western History Association that was held in New Haven in 1992, and he described private collectors' interest in Overland diaries as a virtual cult. So that gives you some sense of how important these materials were to collectors and to Western Americana collections. I think one of the other sort of key pieces of evidence from the Western Americana collection that informs my book is another item from Bruff and another sketch. This comes from an original drawing he did in volume 15 of our Bruff materials, and it's titled The Fate of Many. And what this image does is it really captures the horrors of what would happen to immigrant graves that were left behind. So in the earlier image from Bruff, we saw a good depiction of how people cared for bodies on the trail. In this image, we see the fear and concern of what would happen to what was left behind. And basically, you have a grave, you have an individual and their identity. You can see the scratch marks on the grave marker indicating that we might not be able to read it any longer. And you can see every animal you could imagine attacking these physical remains. And the reason why this image would be so disastrous to viewers in the 19th century is because immigrants and 19th century Americans at large are so attached to graves. And this is what I found in looking through these source materials is that there is an absolute preoccupation with death, dying, and burial. And then as I zoomed out from the trail to the larger context of death and culture in 19th century America, I found that it made perfect sense that there would be this preoccupation. Because in the mid-19th century, pre-antibiotic United States, death was everywhere. It was omnipresent in a way that it just isn't in 21st century America. This is not to discount the tragedies of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as other mortal risks that unevenly confront our communities today. But there is something unique that's happening at this moment. And one way to grasp this omnipresence of death is to grasp variations on one of the most common phrases of 19th century America, if I live. So this is something you might say to a conversation partner when talking about future plans. It's certainly a phrase that appeared in many 19th century letters, the most important medium of communication at that time. One example of this phrase being used in the overland context is when a young man named John W. Minto, who's circled in red in this image here, um, describes how he told his family that he was going to go to Oregon in 1844. So apparently, as he told an Oregon historian at the turn of the 20th century, he decided he was going to go, and that the perfect time to tell his mother and everyone else that he was leaving on this very long and potentially dangerous and deadly journey, was to announce this at the end of Christmas dinner. So I guess they had a lovely meal, they celebrated, and then at the end of the meal, Minto says, "If I live, I will go across the Rocky Mountains." Now, Minto was really lucky. He lives until 1915. He dies at the age of 92. But that was really unheard of for someone of his era. And in fact, people born in the 1820s and 1830s, which are sort of the decades of birth of many overlanders, had some of the lowest life expectancies of the 19th century. So 19th century Americans were powerless to prevent death, but they could and they did choreograph their responses to it. They gathered to listen to their loved ones' dying moral instructions, and they dutifully narrated the scene for distant friends and relatives. With the soul gone, the body became the focus of memorialization. White Americans laid their loved ones out, they wrapped them in shrouds, they buried them close to home, and they waited for the day they would be reunited in heaven. As they had cared for their dead, anticipative survivors cared for their connection with their deceased loved ones. They fingered locks of hair, they gazed on miniature portraits, and most importantly, they visited their graves. Graves were seen as portals between the dead and the living, and tranquil beatific places for the living to commune with the dead. And we can see this same concern about the disconnect from graves and not being able to care from them, a similar concern at least, voiced by Eliza Jane Ross in 1842. Now, While Eliza's words are telling and evocative, they weren't the first piece of evidence that made me begin to investigate the connections between forced removals, or as historian Claudio Sant calls them, deportations of Indigenous peoples and the voluntary migration of immigrants across the Overland Trail. In fact, those words came from someone else, someone who used his power to become one of the direct causal forces of Indigenous removal, President Andrew Jackson. Now, in the period where I was working to place immigrant descriptions of the emotional toll of leaving home and their dead behind in a larger context, I read a book by a historian named Susan Matt. It's about homesickness in US history, and it included an excerpt from a speech, actually, this excerpt from a speech that Andrew Jackson made to Congress in 1830. So Jackson's elected president in 1828. This is the same year that Eliza's uncle John Ross became the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And Jackson kind of comes to the presidency really committed to forcing Indigenous peoples out of their homelands. And he really pushes this militant deportation agenda. And then in his second annual message to Congress in December of 1830, he's sort of talking about how it's going. And he does something which I found surprising. He says, "Doubtless it will be painful to leave the graves of their fathers," referring to Indigenous people, "but what did they do more than our ancestors did, or than our children are now doing?" And when I first read this, I thought, why would Jackson be talking about this Indigenous pain of removal from the graves of their fathers? And how did he come to feel the need to refer to this in his speech? He had no sympathy for Native pain, but some, in fact, many representatives did. The Removal Act had passed earlier in 1830, but it barely passed. And so in this report, Jackson is telling Congress how removal is going, and he's trying to mitigate Native pain by comparing forced removal to voluntary Western movement, to likening the two. So what is he up here to here? I'm wondering why he's saying this and what he's responding to. So I went looking, and what I found is quote after quote after quote of Native peoples and their allies talking to white Americans through oral speeches, through printed materials, periodicals that circulate widely, newspapers, describing their commitment to anti-removal and their commitment to remaining in situ in their homeland in terms of their connections to the graves of their fathers. I found these in primary sources. I found them referenced and cited in multiple books on removal. And what it looks like is a very widespread campaign against forced removal that continually uses this language and this logic, this basis of desire to remain in homeland, a desire described as remaining with the graves of their ancestors. And these particular quotes date back from the 1820s and into the 1830s. And I could talk more about some of the details in the Q&A if we have time. And then I found out something else out as well, that even when Indigenous people are forced to leave, they nonetheless double down on territorial possession and the marking and remembering of their graves, even as they're preparing to leave their homelands. They're again stating it in writings published in the American press, like these two quotes here. They're building stone markers, which are recognizable to white Americans as grave markers before they leave, to make their dead visible. They're also sometimes carrying mementos. In one instance, clods that the Miami took from the top of graves of their ancestors as remembrances before they were forced west. They're showing in all of these ways that even with physical removal, their connection to and sovereignty over the land remains. So, in articulating their attachment to their homelands in terms of their sacred and emotional ties to the graves of their fathers, Indigenous peoples broadcast a particular form of placemaking that also became the metric against which their opponents measured white attachment to home, opponents like Andrew Jackson. By the time white Americans began to create landmarks of death on the Overland Trail, they did so in a context defined by Indigenous activism against removal. Voluntary westward expansion and the contingencies of dying on the Overland Trail did not emerge out of a cultural vacuum, but rather a decades-long cross-cultural conversation about death, graves, and territorial claims. As of fall 2025, most trail sites and monuments continue to foreground and center the immigrant experience. One prominent example is the Donner Monument, also called the Pioneer Monument, which sits high in the Sierra near where the ill-fated Donner Party. Although Sarah Kies was not there at this moment, she died in Kansas near Alcove Springs, so she has nothing to do with what happened in the Sierra. But the rest of the Donner Party, they camped, they starved, and they ate the dead during the winter of 1846 to 1847. Since then, immigrants, local settlers, collectors, historians, and others have endeavored to use these deaths and tragedies to mark these places as U.S. soil, to claim native homelands as their own. But if we go back to the source material of the 19th century, we see something else. A history that foregrounds not only native dispossession, but the way in which the anti-colonial, anti-removal movement of the 19th century shaped the experience and narrative of the colonial project of taking native lands in the West. Thank you.